Hello to my friends who are joining us via recording. Today is April 17th, and we are doing a general lab review to get us ready for the lab exam. So we're going to start with the very earliest stuff, the very first lab packet that is on the lab exam, and that lab packet is muscle tissue. So in our brainstorming of what it is we wanted to talk about today, one of the things that we mentioned we were interested in hearing more about was in how we name muscles. So I'm going to jump to that part of this packet. And if you guys can help me out, my people here in the chat, what page does muscle naming show up on? What page of the lab packet is that? I may be hearing page 5. Yeah, we're shuffling, probably frantically shuffling through our lab packets. Muscle naming. Okay, well, yeah, so it's page 5 of the week 8 packet is what it's sounding like. Yeah, so week 8, this was the last packet that we all got to do in person, right? Back before we knew that we were going online. Isn't it crazy to think about, like, this was before we were online? I was having that thought. For my Friday lab friends, especially my Friday morning lab friends, if you remember really early in the semester, we had Heather who came and taught one of our lab sessions one morning about mitosis. I was emailing her just recently because she's getting ready to finish up her doctoral degree. And I was touching base with her and I was like, can you believe that was this semester that we actually met? Because it feels like it was so long ago. So all that to say, here's the last one that we got to do on site together. And by the way, I'm really sad that we didn't get to say goodbye, right? Like, we didn't know we were ending on site forever. So last lab that we all did together was the lab about muscle tissue, sarcomeres, muscle cells, all that kind of stuff. And to get you ready for learning specific muscles, we talked about the rules for naming muscles. So there are kind of 7 rules that we can use to name muscles. I'll briefly review them and give you some pointers in figuring out how we use these rules. So the big thing that I want to mention here with these rules for naming muscles, I don't recommend that you go through and memorize exactly what these rules say. You've seen on every homework assignment where we ask you a few questions about the muscles of the week and how that relates to the naming of muscles. That's exactly the kinds of questions that you will see on the lab exam. So as you're going through and practicing with the homework assignments, as you're working on the review assignment that we'll talk more about at the end of our time today, as long as you're feeling okay with those practice questions, you should be in good shape. So when we name muscles in the body, 7 kinds of ways we can name them, or 7 kinds of information that we can get from the muscles. So the first kind of information you can get from the muscles is their general location in the body. So their location in the body either can be based on the name of the bone they live on top of. So the best place in the body to see the name of the bone they live on top of is really the skull. So we've got the frontalis muscle here on top of the frontal bone, the temporalis muscle on top of the temporal bone, the occipitalis muscle on top of the occipital bone. The hint that I gave you guys in class way back in the day was if a muscle is named based on the bone it's on top of, you will see the name of the bone in the muscle's name. So we've got 3 muscles here that have what looks like a bone name inside of them. That means that they're named based on their location. We might also name them relative to a structure that one of the bone marking structures you're learning. So the example that we gave for it being relative to a bone marking were 2 of the muscles that we're learning in the back, that are present in the back. I don't think we're learning both of them. But notice with these muscles, they've got this part inside them in their name called spine or spinatus. These 2 muscles are named based on their relative location compared to the spine of the scapula. So I think it was even this week possibly that we were talking about scapula bone markings. When you feel your shoulder blade, you're feeling the spine of the scapula. So the supraspinatus lives superior to the spine, and the infraspinatus lives inferior to the spine. So if you see the name of a bone marking that's inside of a muscle name, that's another tip off for you that I'm using the location of the muscles to name it. So first way you can name a muscle is based on location. We're looking for the names of bone markings. We're looking for the names of bones. If either of those are what I use to name it, that's what I would say the rule that I used, the location of the muscle. Next way that I can name a muscle is based on its shape. So a couple of the examples that we gave for that, remember that we talked about the muscle called the deltoid, which is the big triangle-shaped muscle in the shoulder. I can see it over here. Deltoid looks like the letter delta. That's a Greek letter for us. So the letter delta looks like a triangle. Some other ones we could add to this list would be muscles like trapezius. It is shaped like a trapezoid. We didn't, oh, I spelled that one wrong. Sorry, guys. Trapezius. We didn't really make you guys learn these muscles, but there are muscles in the body called the rhomboids, and they look like a rhombus, which is like a diamond. So if there's some particular shape that a muscle kind of looks like, we might name it based on its shape. But really the big example that we used a lot this semester with this shape was this orbicularis oris and orbicularis oculi, because that orbicularis word means that it's a circle. This would be a good point too, or a good time for me to remind you guys, this name, orbicularis oris, it has two parts to it. You've seen this on the homework. We may or may not have caught it on the homework. I can ask you two questions about how this muscle is named. I could ask you about what this orbicularis word means, but I could also ask you what this oris word means. So please make sure you're checking what your question is asking you about, because if I ask you about orbicularis, you're telling me that this is the shape of the muscle. This is the word that means it's making a circle. But if I ask you about this oris word, the second word in its name, this is actually another word that relates to location. So if you told me that the word oris in its name refers to its shape, that would be wrong. That wouldn't be correct, because this word doesn't tell me about its shape. This word tells me where I find it. Same thing with this oculi word in its name. That looks like the ocular region of the body. Or remember those oculars from a microscope? So oculi meaning ocular region, orbicularis meaning the shape. So please pay attention when I've got more than one word in its name. Read that question slowly and carefully to make sure you're telling me the right word that we're looking for. So we can name things based on their location. We can name them based on their shape. We could name them based on their relative size. So remember the example we did with this was the gluteus muscles. We only learned about two of the gluteus muscles this semester, gluteus maximus and gluteus medius. This word maximus means it's really big. If you have something that's named maximus, you're going to have something that's smaller than it. So something that's named minimus or something that's named medius. By the way, this gluteus word, the first word in its name, this is another example of a location word, because remember we have the gluteal region in the body. So if I have a regional term, that's going to be the location, but maximus, medius, minimus, those are all size words. Same thing with the words longus and brevis. I think those are the main ones that we learned about. Longus, brevis, maximus, medius. I guess the other one that is relative for size, we can use the word major versus the word minor. So for example, this semester we learned pectoralis major. The word major means that it's the bigger one. There is also a pectoralis minor that we didn't make you learn, but that does exist. So relative size words, major and minor, longus and brevis, maximus and medius. All of those are related to this size. of a muscle. We can name a muscle based on the number of origins that it has. So let me put this into the chat because this would be a good thing for us to know. When I talk about muscles, the number of origins that that muscle has, this origin word here, is this a place where it attaches that does or does not move? Does my origin move? My origin on a muscle? Yeah, lots of us are chiming in. When I talk about origins, origins do not move. That's something that more comes into play when we're predicting actions. Your origin is always the place where it attaches that does not move. So some of the muscles that we talked about that have this origin number in their name, it's really easy to tell because they'll start with bi or tri or quad. We've got a number at the end of their name. So biceps brachii has 2 attachment sites that don't move. Triceps brachii has 3. And then we talked about a muscle group called quadriceps femoris. In layman's terms, all the time we talk about our quads, the muscles on the front side of the thigh. Quadriceps means that there's 4 attachments. So the number of attachment sites that aren't moving, that's another way that I could name them. Yes, and so Pam's asking a great question. If your question on the exam or on the homework asked you about biceps, the biceps part of its name, that would be the number of origins, because they got this bi part in it. If your question on the homework or the exam asked you about brachii, now we're talking brachial region, now we're talking location. Yes, so check your question. I tell you the name of the muscle is biceps brachii. We want to slow down in our reading of the question and say, okay, which part of its name do we care about? Do we care about the biceps part of its name, or do we care about the brachii part of its name? So absolutely right, Pam. Yes, if I ask you about brachii, we're back to location. Same thing, femoris. Femoris looks a whole lot like the word femur. So femoris means that we're on top of the femur. That's another location one. Next rule that I can use has to do with the direction that my muscle cells go. So some of the direction words that we talked about, the word rectus, the word transversus, the word oblique. Best place to see these things used is in the abdominal region. And I apologize, my picture uploaded funky today, but you've got this in your lab packet. Remember that in the abdominal region, we actually have 4 different layers of muscles. And the way that I named these muscles has to do with the direction that their muscle fibers run. So this one right here, the 6-pack muscle in the middle of your abdomen, this is called the rectus abdominis. That word rectus in its name means that it runs parallel. So we have rectus abdominis, that's parallel to your vertebral column. We also have a muscle called rectus femoris, and that's the big one on the front of the femur that goes straight up and down, rectus femoris. So this rectus word, that's a direction word for me. It tells me that it's going parallel. Transversus means that it's going opposite, if you will. So if my bone goes down, a transversus muscle goes opposite to it. It's perpendicular. So transversus abdominis is the layer of muscles that's all the way deep inside the abdomen. Transversus abdominis. And then the last layer of muscles that I have are what are called the oblique muscles. And there's 2 layers of those, but both of these oblique muscles always go at an angle. So I can see them on the outside, the external obliques. And then we didn't label it in your picture, but there's also an internal obliques as well that actually travels the opposite direction of the external obliques. But both of those have to do with an angle. Some of our muscles in the body, we talked about the ones that have really big long names. Some of the muscles in our body will tell us all the places that they're attached to. So it's not just the number of places that they attach to, but it's actually the location of them. So we got this big one here, sternocleidomastoid. I think we can fill this in the chat. You guys can help me out here. Sternocleidomastoid. Let's start with the easy part. Sterno means I have an attachment point where? What does sterno mean? Where's that first attachment point? Yeah, exactly. Sterno means that I'm attached to the sternum. Absolutely. Let's go to this part here. This mastoid part is actually a bone marking for us. Remember that we have a bone marking called the mastoid process. Does anyone happen to know, let's see if any of us remember yet, the mastoid process? What bone in the skull is the mastoid process attached to? Does anyone remember? Mastoid process of the, any ideas which bone that one's attached to? Ooh, we're a little stumped. Not the maxilla. The maxilla is inside the skull. Something on the outside of the skull. I'll try to kind of zoom it in a little bit here. We're attached up here. Let me get my pointer back. Attached up here to the mastoid process. This is part of my bone that I find over here on the side of your head. What bone do you have on the side of your head? There we go. Yep, it's attached to the temporal bone. The mastoid process is found on the, let me get my writing back in the right place, the temporal bone. So mastoid process is a marking on the temporal bone. That would be a good one. Here's something to write down in your notes for comparisons. The mastoid process found on the temporal bone. We want to compare that to the bone marking called the styloid process, also found on the temporal bone. The styloid process is much smaller. The mastoid process is much bigger, or it's more massive. So 2 markings of the temporal bone. Make sure we go back and compare those. Okay, so sternocleidomastoid. We've got the mastoid process that we just talked about on the temporal bone. We've got the sternum with this sterno part. And I'll help us out here. This middle part, cleido, this is a special way of talking about the clavicle. So my other attachment site for this muscle is the clavicle, and this middle part here that says cleido, that tells me that it's there. So if we see a name that is made up of multiple bone names, there's a very good chance that it's telling you exactly where it's attached to. We can also compare regional terms that get paired with a bone. So the example is the muscle called brachioradialis. Brachioradialis, we find it in the brachial region on one part and the radius on the other part. So if you see 2 different regional terms or 2 different bones that are in a name, that's going to give you an idea that it's named based on all the places it's attached to. If we have something, let's go back to an example we talked about before, like rectus femoris. Rectus femoris only has 1 location word in it. This rectus word doesn't tell me about the other place it attaches. It just tells me, okay, this is somewhere around the femur. So rectus, remember, was a direction of the muscle fibers. Femoris is a regional term or a location. So we can name it based on the location of everywhere it attaches, or we can name it based on some of those other rules. That last one we talked about was named based on its action. And the way you're going to know that I named something based on its action is we're going to see some of those action words that are inside of the names of the muscles. So we had this really weird example called levator palpebrae superioris. Levator means that we're raising something or elevating something. That was our word, by the way, for this action, was elevate. So we've got this first part of its name that tells me that I'm lifting something up, I'm elevating it. That's an action word. And then we talked about in class how its name palpebrae superioris tells me what it is that I'm elevating. So I'm elevating the upper eyelid. Palpebrae superioris means the eyelid that's on top. So big long name, but when we're talking about the actions, we look at this first word right here. That looks like our action word called elevation, where I raise something up. We also have the ones that we like the best, right? These are the easiest to identify: flexor and extensor. Anytime I see those kinds of words in their name, obviously that's naming it based on its action, because we talked about flexion and extension. Now, again, these have more than one word in their name. So extensor digitorum, we've got information about what it does from extensor and about where it's found, digitorum, or down in the digits, the fingers. Same thing over here. I've got some information about attachment sites, the carpals, the bones in your wrist, and the ulna here with ulnaris. So my biggest hint for you is to go through on the practice assignment that was posted for you last night. You're going to see probably 4 or 5 questions on that assignment that are based on muscle naming. Use those practice questions to help you review, to start practicing looking at what kind of options that you have. And again, please, if it has more than one word in its name, read the question slowly, because I would hate for you to tell me that extensor word means the action of the muscle, but I wasn't asking you about extensor. I was asking you about digitorum. So please read these questions carefully. And yeah, I saw the question that I think someone answered for me. We're in the week 8 lab packet. So that's the general description. And again, you've seen these kinds of questions on every single homework assignment, and you'll see them on that review assignment as well. Do we have any particular questions about this now that we kind of talked through it again? Or if we don't have questions, shoot me a quick thumbs up. Let me make sure we're feeling okay about this, how we name those muscles. Okay, I'm getting some thumbs up. So we'll call it good on the muscle naming. Again, your best bet is just to go through and practice with this. By the way, let me pop up a whiteboard, and then it'll take me forever to get back here. So bear with me. Let's pop a whiteboard really fast. Did you guys notice, how many of us noticed that there is a optional review assignment for the lab final posted? Have any of us seen that yet? Have anyone bumped into that? Optional, perfect. Okay, lots of us have seen it. Optional lab final review assignment. Let me just talk about this briefly, since now I keep mentioning it here in our discussion. When I say it's optional, literally it's optional. It's not going to factor into your grade at all. The purpose of this assignment is to give you a chance to go back and review all the different kinds of topics that we talked about this semester. If you've opened it up, you will see that it is a beast of an assignment. So it is polling, I believe it is polling a total of 44 questions. Yeah, 44 questions, that's what I was thinking. It's polling 44 questions from all of the lab weeks that we've done. Now, what's crazy about it polling 44 questions is even though it polls that many questions, it's not going to hit every topic each time you do it. So it's polling 44 questions. If you go through and complete it once, you may not cover all the topics in the lab packet. You are still responsible for all of those topics, but you may not see them all on your first attempt. Maybe you do it again and you get 44 completely different questions. I do know of those 44 questions it's polling, 5 of them are muscle naming. That's why I kept mentioning that assignment for you. 5 of them are muscle naming to help you get practice with that. And then there's going to be questions about bone markings. There's going to be questions about muscles. There's going to be all kinds of questions mixed in for you. Because this is completely optional, because it doesn't factor into your grade, honestly, here's how I think you should use this. I think you should use this assignment go in and maybe try to work on as many of the questions as you can one time without notes. I'm not going to look at the grade and the score on this. I don't care. So try to do it once, go through, see what you do and don't know, and then start reviewing particular parts that you did really bad on the assignment. Or if there are questions you can't answer at all, that lets you know, okay, I really need to go back to that brain structures packet, for example. So use it as a way for you to quiz yourself. What topics do I not understand? Once you've done that to figure out what you don't understand, then go back and use it again, like 10 times. Go back and use it again and just answer the questions about the spinal cord, or just answer the questions about identifying the muscles, or just answer whatever questions you really want practice with, because maybe you're really awesome at identifying the lobes of the brain. If that shows up on every single version of this review assignment that you do, honestly, you're wasting your study time answering those questions. So decide when you go into it, here's the kinds of questions I want to answer. I'm going to answer these ones. I'm going to submit it and check myself. So it's completely optional. You obviously have unlimited attempts because I'm not grading it. So go through and answer only the questions you want to in each attempt. You don't have to answer all of them ever, because I'm never grading this for a grade. So this is available for you. There's no due date on it. It's open now, and it will be open forever until the end of the lab exam, because at that point, I hope you're not so nerdy that you'd be going back and doing that assignment again after the lab exam. So please go through and use this review assignment. It's as close as we can get. A lot of you asked me about the practice exam that they did for the midterm. Unfortunately, since we're all stuck at home, right, there will be no practice exam for the midterm. So this is as close as we could come up with the little time window that we had here. So that optional assignment, it's posted for you, same place you'd find those regular homework assignments. What questions do we have about that optional assignment? Let me look in the chat here. Is it 44 homework questions, or is it like the exam? Pam asks. It's literally the homework assignment questions on the exam. So when you're doing the exam, questions won't have more than 2 parts. So what I mean by that is, for example, you're identifying structures on the spinal cord. On the exam, I might ask you to just identify 2. On the homework assignment, we might ask you to identify 6. So it's a lot more work than will be on the final exam. So if you can like prime yourself to work through that many parts of the question, you'll be in great shape when we take that exam, because it's way fewer parts to those questions. Yeah, got a thumbs up. Perfect. And this might be one of those things, this review assignment, this would be one of those things that maybe when we're done with our session today, when you send out a quick message to your friends in the group me, do send out, unless it's already been in the group me, do send out a message for me, just letting everyone know that there is a review assignment available, so that everyone's aware of it, can use it to help them this weekend with studying. All right, we good on that? I'm gonna work on pulling back up my slideshow here. Well, actually, I probably don't need this slideshow. Somebody mentioned they wanted to talk a little bit about some of those movement words. Maybe we can use the let's see if I can find a good way to, here, we'll use a picture here to talk about movement words. Remember when you were studying the movement words, one of the things that I told you guys for studying movement words is to learn them in pairs. So if I know the movement word flexion, I should know that the opposite movement word is extension, the thing that does the opposite of it. So flexion and extension, let's actually go one more slide over here. Flexion and extension are opposites of each other. Abduction and adduction are opposites of each other. Dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, they're opposite of each other. If you can memorize who the opposites are and you know what one of those muscle actions looks like, or even better, what it feels like on you, that will help you out a ton when you're working on the exam. So I know I always joke about this, especially in our virtual sessions, right? About how when we're doing these movement word things, you can do an interpretive dance. Hey, here's the good news, right? We're not in class, so no one's going to see your interpretive dance. So 100%, I want you guys, when you're taking this exam, and even when you're doing your practice assignment, no one's going to see you moving around. So do it. Like, so move around. Yeah, the dork factor is way lower than it would have been if we were in class together. So the example that we always like to do, bend my camera down a little bit, flexion and extension. It's easiest to do like we see in the picture here, right? So you've got your arms straight out. When I take my arm from being straight out, like I see right here, and I bring my arm up like this, did I just do flexion or extension? Which movement did I just do? Going from a straight arm to my arm being up like this. I just did a curl. Yep, when I do a bicep curl, when I go from having a big angle or a big difference in their locations to a smaller difference in their location, this is called flexion when I bring them together. The opposite of bringing them together is pulling them apart or increasing the angle. That is the process of extension. So flexion and extension. If you can remember the example with your biceps, doing a curl where I flex things up, and then I do extension when I bring it back down. If you know what that feels like up here in your arm, and then you're sitting taking your exam, and we ask you about a leg muscle, or we ask you about a neck muscle or a back muscle, you know what flexion feels like in one part of your body, you could figure out what it feels like in another part of your body. So learn what these movements feel like and learn how they're opposites of each other, because that's going to help you out a lot. We did flexion and extension. The particular question that I got from somebody was asking about abduction and adduction. My favorite way to remember abduction and adduction is think about having an alien abduction where your arms get pulled up. But remember what we did in class together was I had you all hold up a hand. We held up a hand and then we spread our fingers apart. That's abduction. That little movement right there is abduction. Because the technical definition of abduction is when things move away from the midline. Abduction. We're moving away from midline. Away from midline. The midline of my hand is my middle finger. So when I start with my fingers close together and I spread them apart, I'm doing abduction. Normally when we're asking you about abduction and adduction, I'm not going to do it with the fingers, but that's a small way to help you feel what that feels like. But again, like the dork factor is really low because you're taking the exam alone, right? So feel free to do your abduction and fly away. Make those arms fly away. So abduction, we're moving away from the midline of the body. The arm goes up. Adduction, it goes back down. We can do the same thing with the legs. So it mainly abduction and adduction. That's a movement that we do with the entire arm or the entire leg. I don't know, Ariel, if you raised your hand again on purpose. If so, you're welcome to, if you have a question you want to speak out or type it, or if it might still be left over from before. So just mention that. Okay, perfect. I'll go ahead and dismiss that. It just looked like it popped up on my screen again. I was like, do we have a question? Okay, so abduction, adduction, opposites, flexion and extension, opposites. Are there any other movement words that we are particularly confused about or that we want a little more clarity on? Or give me a thumbs up. The movement words are a little bit basic, so hopefully we can feel those out. Or you can always do a Google search. I do love me the Google, right? You guys know this because we always pull it up all the time. I do love me the Google. So if there's a word that you don't understand, let's consult our friend the Google, and that'll probably help us out. So I did have someone ask me about the inhalation, exhalation stuff. So let me pull that up really fast, and then we'll probably call it good on this particular lab packet. Excuse me. That is down here. Help me out, for those of us that have the lab packet in front of us. Which page do we start doing muscle actions of the torso on? What page do we have the muscles of breathing? Okay, I'm maybe seeing a note that it could be page 11. It's going to be toward the very end of the packet when we start asking you about muscle activity. Okay, yeah, so it's looking like I'm hearing a lot of page 11. So it's there in the back of the packet. Here's what I'll tell you about our muscle action questions. Sometimes in the packets, we have general rules. So for example, all the muscles that live on the front side do flexion. All the ones that live on the back do extension. If we give you a general rule for what muscles do in terms of movement, then I just want you to memorize the rule. But this week is an example of a week where we had specific actions that we learned for the muscles. The other week that's like this is when we talked about the muscles of the head and the neck, where there were specific actions that we told you muscles did. For those particular muscles, I do need you to memorize what the specific action was. When it's a week where we gave you general rules, just memorize the rules. I promise that'll be enough for you. So this was a week where we had specific actions that we needed to know. We needed to know whether the first set of muscles here, when we do the process of breathing, whether they're involved in inhaling or exhaling. So inhaling, as a reminder, is when we breathe in. Exhaling is when we breathe out, when we exhale. So when you do the process of inhalation and you breathe in, we take in air, what actually happens is the size of your thoracic cavity expands. So when we're thinking about muscles that help with inhalation, we're talking about muscles that would make your chest cavity bigger to make space for air to come in. When we're talking about exhalation, we're talking about muscles that actually squeeze the chest cavity back down to push the air out. So I need you guys to help me out with this. We're going to do teamwork here. So when I'm talking about muscles that help me with the process of inhalation, that make the size of my chest cavity bigger, do we have an idea of what muscle or muscles would make my chest cavity bigger when I'm doing the process of breathing? What do we think? Let's light it up in the chat here. Who helps with inhalation? Okay, a couple of us have a vote to start, and that vote's correct. The diaphragm is one that helps me with inhalation. Inhalation makes things bigger. When the diaphragm contracts, when it's relaxed, it looks kind of like a dome. When I contract it, it actually flattens out, and it makes more space inside my chest cavity. So the first muscle involved in making my chest cavity bigger is the diaphragm. Yeah, the second one that a lot of us are honing in on, the second one is the external intercostals. The external intercostals, these are the ones that live on the outside of the rib cage. So they live on the outside of the rib cage. When they contract, they pull the ribs up or they pull the ribs out. So the external intercostals help to make the chest cavity bigger on the outside. The diaphragm helps to make it bigger on the bottom. Both of these are making more space for air to come in. The internal intercostals that are found on the inside of the chest cavity between the ribs, these ones help out with exhalation. Exhalation meaning we're pushing the air out. They're attached to the inside of the ribs. They bring those ribs closer together. So exhalation, the internal intercostals help out with that. Inhalation, it's those muscles on the outside of the chest cavity and the diaphragm that flattens itself down. So first set of actions, we just have to memorize what the diaphragm, the external intercostals, and the internal intercostals do. The second thing we're just going to have to memorize is which way my oblique muscles and my rectus abdominis muscles move the torso. So this has a lot to do with their attachment sites. When I talk about rectus abdominis versus my obliques, some of these muscles are found in the middle of the abdomen. Some of these muscles are found on the sides or laterally, shall we say, on the abdomen. Which of these muscles is found in the middle of the abdomen or the middle of the torso? Which ones live in the middle? Yeah, a couple of us have chimed in. Rectus abdominis is your six-pack muscle, lives in the very middle of your abdomen. Because it lives in the middle and it goes straight up and down, this is the muscle that's going to allow you to do a crunch. So flexing you forward is the job of the muscle that lives in the very front, along the front side of the abdomen. When we start talking about these oblique muscles, the ones that live on the side of the torso, and their name tells me they're at an angle on the side over there, these are going to be the ones that help the torso bend to the side or bend laterally. So we just have to memorize, because there's not really a general rule for them, that my oblique muscles help my torso to go side to side, help me to bend over, back and forth, those sideways crunches, right? And then rectus abdominis helps me to do crunches, the normal crunches, forward and backwards. We did our first origin and insertion activity this week. I would recommend, if you have time and if you have paper, to print off this last page of each of the lab packets with the origin and insertion activities in it. Print off those packets and practice with them, because I promise you on the exam, we're going to have questions that are similar to this. So what I mean by that is you're going to get a picture of a skeleton on the exam, and we're going to have places on that skeleton that are marked in blue. Well, places on that skeleton that are marked in green. And we're going to ask you to predict the action of that muscle based on the origin, the blue part, and the insertion, the green part. Hey, let's remind ourselves, when a muscle contracts, is it the blue part or the green part that moves? Is it the origin or the insertion that moves? Yeah, my insertion is the part that moves. Now, again, we've just talked about how like all of the dork factor of this exam has gone way down since you're taking it at home by yourself. 100% on your prediction questions, I want and need you to act these things out. So here, let's do this one really fast. The origin on rectus abdominis is the pubic crest and of the pubis bone and the pubic symphysis. That's these places down here. Okay, there's my origin in blue. My insertion, it talks about being the xiphoid process of the sternum and the caudal cartilages, the cartilage that ribs attach to. So here's my xiphoid process, and I'm sorry, it's so light here. And then I got my costal cartilages up here. Then we do some connect the dots. 100% on you when you're taking the exam. If I see that my moving part is up here and I see that my non-moving part is here, I want you to literally touch those places on your body, and then where your hand that's at the moving part needs to start moving toward the non-moving part, move your whole body. Because when I move my whole body based on the part that's supposed to move compared to the part that's not supposed to move, that will help me to answer the question. That's going to help me to know, in the case here of rectus abdominis, that's going to help me to know whether it's the pelvis that's moving or whether it's the rib cage. I just acted it out, and hopefully you can act it out yourself too, to know that the rib cage is what's actually moving when this muscle contracts. So we'll have to predict what the action is that a muscle does, and we're going to have to predict which part of the body actually does the movement. So please, please complete these activities more than once. If you can do these activities, you will be golden for those prediction kind of questions on the exam, because you'll act it out. You'll be touching the two parts of your body, and you'll bring one part toward the other, and then you'll just have to use those movement words to describe it. So highly recommend the origin insertion activity. Please do that multiple times, because I promise you there's going to be multiple questions asking you to predict things like that. What questions do we have about the origin insertion activity, or those kinds of prediction questions? I'll put that out there both ways. So what kind of questions do we have about this, or do we have about predictions in general? Okay, well, I got 2 thumbs up, so I guess we don't have a lot of questions right now. We'll call that good then. Again, please act things out. Nobody's going to see you. Nobody's going to judge you. And 100%, if you were doing it in class, you should be acting them out anyway. So act them out at home, and I know that'll help us out a lot. All right. That about knocks out our muscle stuff here. Let's see. I didn't really have any questions about that neuron packet. I had a question about ventricles and cranial nerves. So let's bump to the ventricles and cranial nerves week. We're going to that's the lab packet. Week 13. So if you want to track with me, we're going to week 13. Previously week 12. So if you printed it early, it might say that it's week 12. If you have your week 13 packet in front of you, help me out and let's help out our friends here. What page is my ventricles picture on? What page did this one come from? Can we tell? Okay, I'm maybe here in page 3 of the week 13 packet. Okay, so page 3 sounds like it's where it's at. Yep, page 3. Okay, so let's talk about this. First thing I want us to talk about here with the ventricles, because we talked about this in lecture 2. The ventricles are filled with something. What are the ventricles filled with? What's inside of these weird things? Yes, lots of us chiming in. These are fluid-filled spaces inside your brain filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So we like these pictures here because they give you a frame of reference for what this looks like inside your brain. So this is when I'm looking head on. If I were to be able to look through your skull and to look through your brain tissue, I would see these fluid-filled spaces inside your brain. This is a head-on view if I was staring inside your brain. This over here is a lateral view showing me what they look like from the side. So there are 4 ventricles in the brain. The first ventricles that we have in the brain, there's actually 2 of these ones called lateral ventricles. And then we have a 3rd ventricle and a 4th ventricle. One of the things that you'll want to make sure you're able to do is, we put it in the lab packet as a study pro tip. We said to trace the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through these structures. Here is your wink, wink, nudge, nudge. That if you have not done that yet, if you've not made yourself a flow chart that tracks the flow of cerebrospinal fluid through each of the ventricles and the tubes that connect those ventricles, we got to do that. Like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We got to do that because that's gonna help you out on the exam. So we're going to go through and we'll talk about the structures in order to help us with our tracking, or helping us with the learning objective of tracing the flow of CSF, describing how it moves through the brain. When I talk about the ventricles, we start up at the highest ventricles. That's these ones up here. The name of these two ventricles up here, what are these ones called? My two largest ones up here. Yeah, several of us are chiming in here for me. My two largest that I see are the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles. When I look head on at my ventricles, I see them they're the ones that are the most lateral, the ones that are most toward the side. When I'm looking at the brain from the side, the lateral ventricles look a lot like a horseshoe. So I've got two lateral ventricles that look like horseshoes from the side, or they're found over very far laterally when I'm looking at it head on. So my first ventricles, where we're saying that this whole story begins, we start in the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles have some blood vessels inside of them. Actually, all my ventricles have these blood vessels. What's the name of those leaky blood vessels that make the cerebrospinal fluid inside the ventricles? Yeah, lots of us are chiming in here. So we have a special kind of leaky blood vessels that make CSF. Their name is the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus. Leaky blood vessels that make cerebrospinal fluid. I find these leaky blood vessels inside each of the ventricles. So I have some at our model, we might be able to see it. There's some that kind of live inside this part of the horseshoe here, making cerebrospinal fluid for me. I have them in each of my other ventricles as well. I mention that to say that I'm making new fluid up here inside my horseshoe. Because I'm making new fluid inside that horseshoe, I need to have a way to drain it out of there. The way that I drain fluid from the lateral ventricles into my third ventricle here in the middle, what's the name of the tube that I send fluid from the lateral ventricles into the third ventricle? Which of these two tubes transports it for me? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in. It's really hard to type, right? So I won't make you type the whole thing. The tube that drains the lateral ventricles into the third is this big long one right here, the interventricular foramen. Now, I'm going to be real honest with you. I don't think we can really see the interventricular foramen on this picture. So don't try to label it over here. You cannot see it very well. Honestly, I can only kind of see it even on this model right here. So let me put a little arrow. See that little tube? Here, we'll zoom in. This little space right here. Oh, that was bad. Can I undo? Nope. Okay. Well, this little space right here, there's a little line that goes between a horseshoe down into the duck face down here. That's my interventricular foramen. Interventricular foramen. And its job is to take fluid from these horseshoes down into this space right here that is the third ventricle. So connecting the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle is this thing called the interventricular foramen. So we've already said it multiple times. We'll add our label here. Third ventricle. Easiest to see from the side here. The third ventricle looks a lot like the terminology I used for it before is the duck face. We got the duck face ventricle going on over here. We also can see the third ventricle though. That's this area right here on the picture. So we can't see the tube that connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle because they're really close together from this view, but you can see it a little bit right here. So interventricular foramen, the tube that connects the lateral ventricles to the third ventricle. I saw a question, Would the choroid plexus, the first place CSF would be made, and then it goes into the lateral ventricle? Yes, that's correct. If we want to start our flow chart at the very beginning, we'll say we're making cerebrospinal fluid from the choroid plexuses. Like I mentioned, we have choroid plexus in every single ventricle. But if we want to put this in order, we're doing our tracing the flow thing. Yes, we would say that the first part of flow is I have some choroid plexus in these lateral ventricles. They spit out CSF. Now we're in the lateral ventricle. Now we got to go from there. So to answer your question, Ariel, yes, the choroid plexus would be the first thing on our list. Okay, lateral ventricle into the interventricular foramen, into the third ventricle. Now we have this big long tube right here. This big long tube right here, I'll just draw my arrow over, is this thing called the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct connects together the third ventricle with our last ventricle that I see right here. So the last ventricle is the fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle. I can see it really well from the lateral view. I can also see it really well from the head-on view right here. To help you with identifying the lateral ventricle, or excuse me, the fourth ventricle, so sorry. The fourth ventricle is always right in front of the cerebellum. So when I look from the side, the space I see in front of the cerebellum, that's the fourth ventricle. It's also the lowest ventricle that you see when you're looking at things head on. So if I was looking at this particular view of the ventricles, here's my fourth ventricle here at the bottom. Here is my fourth ventricle when I look here from the side. Hey, here's a correlation into a later lab packet. This tube right here is one of the places that the fourth ventricle can drain its fluid into. This tube goes all the way down the spinal cord, actually. What's the name of this tube that's down here at the bottom? Yeah, a couple of us have chimed in. That tube that I labeled at the bottom, that's actually the central canal. That's actually the structure that goes down in the very middle of the spinal cord and goes all the way down the spinal cord. So the fourth ventricle is connected to the central canal. It also, though, has some openings in it that allow it to spit out the extra cerebrospinal fluid into what's called the subarachnoid space. The subarachnoid space. This is a space between the meninges, between that connective tissue that's around the brain and the spinal cord, that I can send my cerebrospinal fluid to spit it out when I'm done with it. So the subarachnoid space, let me bounce back because I think it's right here. Yep. This is my meninges model that shows me the spaces around things. My subarachnoid space is this space right here. This is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Because it's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, I've got to get that from somewhere. It spills out of the fourth ventricle, and then I can fill this space here with that cerebrospinal fluid. Hey, by the way, I've got these little bubbles right here. These are called arachnoid granulations. Can anyone help me out in the chat? Do we remember what an arachnoid granulation, or these little bubbles right here, what's the job of this bubble? Does anyone remember what that bubble does for me? The answer to your question, Isabella, is yes. Yeah, between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid granulations. Any idea what this does? Yeah, so Pilar is mentioning another structure that we need to know on this model here. So this structure right here, shown in dark blue here, this is something called the dural venous sinus. The dural venous sinus. This is a vein. Runs along the middle on top of your brain, runs along the middle right underneath the skull. This is where oxygen poor blood goes when we're done with it at the brain. It's also the place where I can dump my cerebrospinal fluid that's extra from this subarachnoid space, dump that into the dural venous sinus. This is how I get rid of cerebrospinal fluid to get it back into the bloodstream. Because remember, we talked about during some lecture office hours how we kind of have a circle of life thing going on. So the choroid plexus are a type of blood vessel, which means they have fluid in them called plasma. That's the extracellular fluid of blood is plasma. When I leak out that plasma into my ventricles in the brain, and I call it cerebrospinal fluid. When I leak it back into the dural venous sinus, it becomes plasma again. So to make sure that I never end up with too much cerebrospinal fluid, I use these little structures here called arachnoid granulations or arachnoid villi, depending on what your Google search shows you, to dump that fluid back into the dural venous sinus. I know I ask this every time, but I'll just keep asking it here. If these don't drain cerebrospinal fluid and I have too much cerebrospinal fluid, what's that medical condition called when I have too much cerebrospinal fluid around my brain? What did we call that from lecture? We didn't really talk about it in lab. What do we call that? Exactly. Yep. That big long word, hydrocephalus. Hydrocephalus, when I have too much cerebrospinal fluid that I find around the brain. Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to be real honest with you guys. We are not going to ask you to identify the ventricles on this model here because you guys didn't get a chance to see it in real life. So what I want you guys to focus your study time on when you're learning the ventricles, I want you to focus your study time on identifying the ventricles in pictures like this. I want you to do a Google Images search because I want you to go through some other pictures that look like this to practice identifying the ventricles and the tubes and that kind of stuff. Because we didn't get a chance to look at the model together, we're not going to ask you questions related to the ventricles on that model. So please focus your study time on pictures like this and do a Google Images search because we pull a lot of images from there as well. So please check that out. What is the dark blue inside the subarachnoid space? Bounce back. Let's see if we can put it. I'll put that to the class. See if we have any guesses. What do we think this dark blue is right here? Any ideas? Any guesses of what this might be? Yeah, Kelly's right. This is a vein. This is a vein. Yep. So we have little tiny veins that how it's branching down closer to the brain tissue itself. I believe there's a picture in your lecture notes from lesson number 11 that shows you all of the blood vessels that are attached to the outside of the brain. Because remember, the brain takes a ton of blood. So this is one of those blood vessels that to get down close enough to the brain, it's actually all the way in the subarachnoid space. So, yep, we got a little vein that we're seeing here inside the subarachnoid space. Absolutely. Okay, you're welcome. Let me take a peek at this one. How are we feeling about, oh, cranial nerves is this one. Perfect. Okay, let's do cranial nerves because we asked about that. Okay, when we talk about cranial nerves, let's remind ourselves that to identify the cranial nerves, we always start in the front and work our way back. And when we move from one place to another, we start in the middle and work our way out. So we always go from, if we want to use our anatomy words here, anterior to posterior. And we always go from medial to lateral. That's how we're going to number our nerves. Okay, so let's talk about numbering our nerves here. First nerve that we're looking at is this right here. First nerve and most recognizable. Like I hope we all can find cranial nerve number 1. Cranial nerve number 1 is the olfactory nerve. So these structures I'm looking at right here are called the olfactory bulbs. Let's see if we remember, because we got to know functions here. What do the olfactory nerves have to do? Absolutely. Yep. Olfactory means smell. So think about it. Your nose is on the very front of your face. So my very front cranial nerves, olfactory nerves, they help with the sense of smell. Remember when we talked about this in office hours before? This is technically the beginning of cranial nerve number 2. Here's the other beginning of cranial nerve number 2. But what we did is we added a little X right here. Remember, we added this X. This is called the optic chiasm, or literally the X. That's what chiasm means. So this is cranial nerve number 2. It starts by itself like that, but we added that little X to the top of it. So cranial nerve number 2. We're working our way from the front, anterior to posterior. So here was number 1. Number 2 was back behind it. Then we go down to number 3. Number 3 is down here in the middle. I'm going to zoom in just a little bit to help us see. Cranial nerve number 3. I can see it on one side right here. I can see it on the other side right here. Cranial nerve number 3 is called the oculomotor nerve. And the oculomotor nerve, who remembers, what did we say that nerve did for us? What does oculomotor do? Exactly. Yep. A couple of us have chimed in here. Its name, we've got this motor part in it. Motor means movement. Oculo means eyes. Hey, remember, when we're learning cranial nerves, we're trying to learn them in groups, right? So we can remember what they do. Number 3, number 4, number 6. All of those cranial nerves move the eye. So if we remember those numbers, number 3, number 4, number 6, all of those work together for eyeball movement. So cranial nerve number 3, that's the one that's here in the middle of the pons. Cranial nerve number 4 is this little one that you see right here. And I can see it on this side too, this little line. A couple of fun facts about number 4. It is the smallest one in the body. And it's also actually attached to the backside of the brainstem. So that's why it's a little bit different than some of my other nerves. This one actually wraps around from the backside. So cranial nerve number 3 in the middle. Number 4 is next to it, down a little bit farther. Cranial nerve number 5, as we see it on our model, is this big circle right here. But remember, when we did this in office hours before, we put these little branches on it. We gave it 1, 2, and 3 big branches right there. This is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve number 5. This is the biggest cranial nerve in the body. So number 4 is the littlest. Number 5 is the biggest. It's that big white circle we see on the side of the pons. Then we work our way down. We go back to the middle. These 2 right here in the middle, these are cranial nerve number 6, the abducens nerve. So number 6 is back to the middle when we're looking on here. Do 3, 4, and 6 all connect directly to the eye? They go to different places around the eyeball. So different muscles that live on the outside of the eyeball. 3, 4, and 6 all go to different eyeball muscles. Correct. Yes. So 3 up here, 4 over here, and number 6 right here. All of those going to eyeball muscles. By the way, check back in the recordings of office hours. Whatever day we did this packet in office hours, I helped you guys draw a clown face to help you memorize the functions of the cranial nerves. So go back to that recording and look for that clown face because it might help you with actions of the nerves. So we got 3, 4, big number 5 over here, number 6. Then we get into some places where cranial nerves live really close to each other. So that makes them a little bit more challenging. Let me see if I can zoom in any more. A little bit. Yep. Okay. Next set of cranial nerves that we're looking for are 7 and 8. So here on the outside, the lateral side, that's going to be number 8, vestibulocochlear. Here on the medial side is number 7, the facial nerve. So I'll go to my other side over here. The one on the lateral side, Number 8, the one on the medial side, number 7. Number 7 and number 8 live right next to each other. So if we see anything pointing to these clumps that I have right here, that's number 7 if I point to the medial side, or number 8 if I point to the lateral side. Then we go down here to my next group of clumped nerves. Got one on top and one a little bit down below it. The one on top is number 9, cranial nerve number 9, called the glossopharyngeal nerve. The bottom half of it is cranial nerve number 10, called the vagus nerve. Vagus means that it's wandering. So cranial nerve number 10 goes all over the place in the body, down into the chest, down into the abdominal organs, all that kind of stuff. Cranial nerve number 10. Then we've got this big chunk right here. This big chunk right here is number 11, cranial nerve number 11, this big chunk. From office hours, I mentioned to you guys that in anatomy, this nerve is actually very controversial because it's actually attached to the spinal cord and not the brainstem. So some anatomists say this should not be considered a cranial nerve. But for the sake of our learning, we're calling this a cranial nerve. We're calling it nerve number 11, the accessory nerve. Then we have to go back to our little nerve here in the middle that we skipped, this little guy up here. This little guy up here in the middle of the medulla, this one's called the hypoglossal nerve. That's number 12 here in the middle, cranial nerve number 12. Correct, Pilar, there was an error on the homework assignment. That's why I'm taking time to go through and help out with this. So I'm in the process of fixing the keys. So this is what we want to learn for our locations of the cranial nerves. Number 9 is up top on the side. Number 10 is down below it. Number 11 is lower than that, down here on the spinal cord. And then number 12, we bounce back to the middle. Okay, so let me zoom out. All my cranial nerves here. Any questions about cranial nerve locations? Right now, it might mean that potentially, Pilar. Yes, I'm in the process, like I said, of fixing that. I've got a lot of things on my list to fix, so I'm working on fixing that too. We have not had a dance party yet today. Does anyone feel like dancing with those emojis? Do we get a dance party today? It's Friday. Friday would be a good day for a dance party. Ooh, nice. We got the party hat going on. Here, I'll give you guys our penguin for the day. We'll do the penguin really fast before we move on. Our daily penguin. I'm getting better at drawing them faster too, so look at me go, look at me go. Is 11 considered part of, let me go back to my picture here, part of the top of the cervical nerves? No, 11 isn't one of the cervical nerves. It's a little bit higher than where the cervical nerves are. So it's not one of the cervical nerves that you're learning, that because this one doesn't go out of, this is not going to go out of the spinal cord in the same way that those cervical spinal nerves do. But yeah, it's down more on the spinal cord, but not considered like C1, C2. It's not one of the cervical spinal nerves. But that's a good question, definitely. All right, let me look at my list here. Okay, we wanted to talk about our muscles. That is this packet. So let me go to here. Let's go to here. Let's zoom out. Okay, when we are talking about identifying muscles, especially of the forearm, we're going to start with the forearm. Here's a reminder in anatomy. This part's called the forearm. This part's called the arm. Okay, I gotta be real honest with you guys. I had an anatomy nerd moment today with my family. So I have this really big bathtub in my bathroom, and sometimes my daughter gets to take baths with me or my husband in the big bathtub. She just loves this. So yesterday my husband's in the big bathtub with her, and he says, it's okay for you to wash my arm And so Evelyn starts to rub soap up here. And my husband is like, no, I want you to wash. And he showed her this part. I want you to wash my arm, not up here. And she keeps doing it up here. And I called out to him, I was like, you know, technically she is washing your arm. And my husband just kind of did one of those groan things, right? So technically this up here of my husband's like, this whole thing is the arm. So she can wash my lower arm. And I was like, well, be technical. It's the forearm. Not that my daughter has any idea, right? But technically in anatomy, yes, she's so smart, right? She's playing the system for sure. Technically in anatomy, this part up here where the humerus lives is the arm region. And technically this part down here where we got the radius and the ulna, that's the forearm. So we're going to start here looking at our muscles of the forearm. And then we'll transition into looking at our muscles of the arm. When we talk about the muscles of the forearm, the first thing that we want to know when we're doing muscles of the forearm, whether we're on well, here we go back to my pointer, the anterior side, as in the side that when you're in anatomical position is facing forward, or whether we're on the posterior side, which would be the side that'd be facing backwards. There are two muscles that are always our reference point to help us with identifying other muscles in those regions. So the two muscles we must be able to identify because they're my reference point muscles. Palmaris longus on the front side, and let me find it here, extensor digitorum on the back side. Palmaris longus and extensor digitorum. These would be ones, and we might even do this here in just a couple of minutes, where you definitely want to do a Google search to make sure we can find these guys. Because if we can find palmaris longus, and if we can find extensor digitorum, then we should be able to use our reference points to figure out where the other ones are. So let's start here with our anterior view. When I'm looking here in the anterior view at the arm, palmaris longus. Its name says palmaris. Which part of the body is palmaris going to be going into? Where does palmaris? What does that sound like? What part of the body? I promise it's not a trick question. There we go. Everybody's answer showed up literally all at the same time. Palmaris looks like the palm, the palm of the hand. So when I look at my picture here, see this tendon that's down here in the palm of the hand? This long extension, that's my tendon. Here's the muscle itself. There's palmaris longus. The big one that's in the middle on the anterior side, that's palmaris longus. Once I find the middle one, palmaris longus, then I can do my reference points here for flexor carpi radialis and flexor carpi ulnaris. These are muscles that have information about their attachment sites or where I'd find them. So not a trick question. This radialis part of its name, radialis, where do I find radialis? What's that by? Yeah, it's by the radius, right? And the radius, as someone mentioned for us, that's on the thumb of the hand. So flexor carpi radialis, I find this one by the radius. That's going to be the muscle that's right here. That's next door to palmaris longus on the thumb side. Next door to palmaris longus. So flexor carpi radialis on the radius side. So flexor carpi ulnaris is going to be on the ulna side. So the ulna side over here. Ulna side, flexor carpi ulnaris. Now here's a wink wink, nudge nudge for us. Both of these muscles have the word flexor in their name. When you are memorizing your rules for how we move things in the arm, flexors always live on the front. So these muscles that I see on the front side of the hand, flexor carpi ulnaris and flexor carpi radialis, they're on the front side, along with palmaris, palmaris longus. All of those live on the side of the forearm. On the back side of the forearm, that's where all the extensors live. Muscles that live on the back side of the arm are my extensors. So keep that straight in your mind that flexors are on the front, which is really nice, right? Because they're both F's. Extensors are on the back. So we're going to zoom in a little bit here, help us out with our extensors. Extensor digitorum is the one that I told you guys we're going to reference. See how there's a muscle here that has little tendons that go down into the digits, down into the fingers? This is extensor digitorum. It's the big one that goes into the fingers, extensor digitorum. And then we've got extensor carpi radialis and extensor carpi ulnaris. Just like we saw with the flexors, it's going to be referencing to where they're located versus the radius and ulna. So help me out here. This one that I just drew a line on, this one's on the thumb side. Here's the little thumb. Which muscle is this one right here, since we're on the thumb side? Yeah, you just have to give me the last word. I won't make you type the whole thing, right? This is going to be extensor carpi radialis. We're on the radius side. We're on the thumb side. Extensor carpi ulnaris is a little bit hard to see, so I'm not going to use this picture on the exam to help you see it. But extensor carpi ulnaris is going to be on the ulna side of extensor digitorum. So on the ulna side, by the little pinky over here, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor carpi radialis on the radius side, on the front. I'm going to be honest with you, brachioradialis is really tough to see, so don't focus on trying to find that one in these pictures as much. Here, I'm going to do a quick Google search to see if I can find you some good, let's see, extensors of the hand. Let's see if I can find us a good picture to pull up. That is too small. Bear with me. Trying to find a good big one for us. Not labeled. This one's not terrible. Okay, let me share my, well, I'll share my screen with you and show you. It's not the best one. I know that you guys can do a Google search and you can find a good one here. Let's do a Chrome tab right here. Okay. So I did a search for the extensors. What I should actually probably do is just the arm muscles themselves. Is this one big? That one's really tiny. That was terrible. Let's go back here. So we're looking at, here's flexor carpi, oh, that's my flexor, sorry. Flexor wraps around from the backside. So going down here into the digits, see my big long tendon that goes into the digits? That's extensor digitorum. Next to it, we have extensor carpi ulnaris on the ulna side. At extensor carpi radialis, we're seeing up a little bit higher on the radius side. So here, let's just do this. Forearm muscles. Here's a good one for the other side. We'll do the other side here. See palmaris longus that's going down into the palm of the hand. And then we got our flexor carpi ulnaris on the ulna side, flexor carpi radialis on the radius side. They don't have it labeled, but here would be my brachioradialis. They skipped that one. So I mentioned it before, and I'll mention it again. Google Images is absolutely your friend. Please go through and do Google searches, especially for the forearm. I promise you we're going to do our best to get you a good picture to help you label these muscles. But if we can identify, yeah, these are all tiny. Sorry, guys. If we can identify palmaris longus, if we can identify extensor digitorum, those are going to be the big ones to help us out. So I apologize. This is a big waste because I'm not finding good ones. That's pretty good. Palmaris longus going down into the palm of the hand. And then radialis on the radius side, ulnaris on the ulna side. All right. Help me out in the chat. What questions do we still have about that? Do we have any particular questions about that? Or give me a thumbs up if we feel okay. I'm going to go back to my picture that we were working on. Here's a picture we were working on. Okay, well, I got one thumbs up, and I don't have an overload of questions. I'm wondering, Pilar, if you meant to put spinatus, would be the spine, maybe, related to the spine. Yeah, so Pam was mentioning we can use these muscles to help us with our descriptions. Absolutely. Yes, so when we're looking at how we name these muscles, these are great ones that help us out with the naming stuff. So extensor, that's an action word. And then carpi and ulnaris, those are both location words. We've got this word longus here. Longus means that it's the long one. I got that question during office hours a couple weeks back. Extensor carpi radialis longus. The reason its name is so long and crazy is because there's actually also a brevis that we're not making you learn. But that also has to do with its relative size. So these are good for descriptions. And that's correct, Pilar. The muscle infraspinatus, yes, that would refer to the spine of the scapula, or supraspinatus, that refers to the spine of the scapula. Hey, I guess we did miss the arm muscles, didn't we? We didn't talk about these ones. Want to talk about these really fast? Yes, so location, that's correct, Pilar. The muscles that live in the arm region, the technical arm region that we need to know, biceps brachii and triceps brachii. Biceps brachii or triceps brachii. When you are in anatomical position, which of those two muscles is on the front? Who's on the front when you're in anatomical position? Yeah, a couple of us are chiming in. The one that's on the front when we're in anatomical position is biceps brachii. So again, our dork factor on the exam has gone way down, so we can actually hold up our arm the way that muscle man is holding up his arm. When we hold up our arm the way he's holding up his, we can tell that this side is the front side of his arm. So this muscle right here is the biceps muscle on the front side, biceps brachii. This muscle here on the back is the triceps brachii, because this is the back side of his arm over here. This is the front side of his arm over here. When we look here, I'll zoom in on my other one. When we look here on this muscle man, it's actually probably easier to see the big triceps muscle right here on the back side of the arm and the biceps muscle here on the front of the arm. So biceps always on the front, triceps always on the back. Biceps and triceps. All right, the last thing that I for sure got questions on today was spinal cord stuff. So let me pull up my spinal cord pictures. I need you guys to help me out. For those of us that had some questions about the spinal cord, what are the things that we're wanting to discuss related to the spinal cord? Got about 15 minutes left. What specifically related to the spinal cord would we like to discuss? Are we wanting to discuss big picture spinal cord or the cross section of the spinal cord? Maybe that's a better question. Do you want to talk about it's split in half, or do we want to look at the whole thing? The cross section? At least one vote for the cross section. So we'll start here. Okay, when we're looking at the spinal cord, there are 3 different models that we can use to identify structures. So we want to make sure as we're going through and practicing, both with this week's homework assignment and with that practice lab final exam assignment, that we can identify those structures on any of the spinal cord models. So first thing that we need to figure out when we look at a spinal cord model is which side is dorsal and which side is ventral. And there are two ways that we can tell dorsal versus ventral. Help me out in the chat. What can I use when I'm looking at these models to determine dorsal versus ventral? Yeah, so the first one, a bunch of us are mentioning, this guy right here, dorsal root ganglion. That's the first thing I can look for. Second thing I can look for, we mentioned this actually kind of in one of our lecture discussions, I can actually look for the location of the dorsal gray horn. So the dorsal gray horn kind of touches the edge of spinal cord. The ventral gray horn is not going to go as close to the edge of the spinal cord. Really, though, your best bet for figuring out dorsal versus ventral is really going to be this structure right here, the dorsal root ganglion. Hey, by the way, the word dorsal, what would be an easy word to describe what dorsal means? What's the other word that we sometimes use for dorsal? Yeah, posterior or backside. Dorsal is the same thing. A lot of the pictures that you'll see, the labeled pictures that you have, are calling it posterior. That's the same thing as dorsal. The textbook that we use calls it dorsal still. So that's why you see the dorsal terminology, but posterior is the same thing. So posterior or backside, all of those things are dorsal. So the dorsal root ganglion, that's really the first thing you want to look for every time you look at a spinal cord model. The dorsal root ganglion, I can see it right here on this particular model. See this bump that's back here? I can see it over here as well. See this bump that's back here? See, this whole structure right here is the way that I bring some neurons into my spinal cord. This whole structure back here is called the dorsal root. The dorsal root. Oh, you can't really see that. Sorry. This whole structure is the dorsal root. It is my branching thing that goes into the back side of the spinal cord. The way I know that this is the dorsal root is because of this big bump on it, the dorsal root ganglion. Or when I look over here, the dorsal root ganglion, the big bump on this dorsal root. That goes into the back side of the spinal cord. The front side of the spinal cord also has neurons that are leaving the spinal cord. This front side here is called the ventral root. Anytime you see this word root, we're meaning something that attaches to the spinal cord. Roots come together, the dorsal root on the back side and the ventral root on the front side, they fuse together to make this structure right here. Does anyone know what's this structure right here? What do we call it when the dorsal root and the ventral root meet up with each other? What's it called when they fuse together? Well, so a ramus actually comes after I form this structure. Yeah, first I have to put things together to make a spinal nerve. So when I bring my two roots that are attached to the spinal cord together, I make a spinal nerve. A little bit farther off of this nerve, then I'll start to branch it into things called a ramus. And that's what we saw on our model that has it in the vertebrae. They have the ramus or the branches on it. But make sure we keep straight that a root is attached to the spinal cord. So a dorsal root and a ventral root attached to the spinal cord. Those two roots come together to make a spinal nerve. Later, that spinal nerve will branch. So we'll look at those ramus, or each of the ramus in a moment here. So we've got our dorsal root and our ventral root, that dorsal root ganglion. So based on the labeling we've done before, what would I call this structure right here? What's this part of my model right here that I just circled? Yeah, exactly. Since we know that's the back side of my spinal cord, because we got our dorsal root back there, this would be considered the dorsal horn, the one that goes back and actually touches the edge of the spinal cord. Gray matter, remember, is always arranged in what we call horns. So I've got my dorsal horn back here. On the front side of my spinal cord, I have my ventral horn. And then here on the outside of my spinal cord, I have my lateral horn. So gray matter arranged in these things called horns. And remember from our office hours this week that when we talk about the white matter of the spinal cord, it's arranged in lab, we're going to call them into funiculi. In lecture from this week's lesson, we're calling them tracts. Tracts and funiculi are the same thing. Dr. Allis just likes tracts better because it's English. So what we said in our lecture discussion is anywhere that I point an arrow that's white matter in the spinal cord, anywhere that's white matter in the spinal cord, you would always tell me that's a white matter funiculus, or that's where I find those tracts, because they fill up literally everywhere in the spinal cord, in the white matter of the spinal cord, excuse me. So let me mention the word that we tossed out there. We tossed out the word ramus, ventral ramus, dorsal ramus. For me to be able to have a ramus, literally that word means a branch. For me to be able to have a ramus or a branch, I have to have a spinal nerve first. So I form my spinal nerve right here. I've got a spinal nerve here. And then see how I've got a branch that comes off the back side and a branch that comes off the front side. My backside branch back here is the dorsal ramus, the one that comes off the back. My front side branch right here is the ventral ramus. This part that directly attaches to the spinal cord, remember, that part was not a ramus, that was a root. So roots attached to the spinal cord. Ramuses are the rami, technically, are these things that branch off after I've formed a spinal nerve, where the dorsal root and the ventral root come together. Pam, I see that you've raised your hand. Either if you want to turn on your mic and speak out your question, if you want to type it, feel free to do that for me.
It's too much typing, so that's why I'm just going to raise my hand and talk to you.
Yeah, that's totally fine.
On the one that is listed as 10, and in the video you went over it, that's the epidural space. Or I can't remember
the epidural space. That's correct.
Okay, yep. The lining that's directly above it on the homework for 14, it points to that lining up there. It says that I got it wrong because I thought it's the dura mater.
Yeah, so that is, I am aware of that key error as well, that I'm working on fixing it. This is some connective tissue that's on the outside of the epidural space.
Okay.
The dura mater itself is down closer. So I guess if we zoom it in here, it's this little guy right here, number 9. That's going to be the dura mater. So
right. So,
correct. Yes.
So up there is correct. Not. That's not
up there is an extra. Yeah, that's not the dura mater. That's too far out to be the dura mater. This is just the connective tissue around that. That's a space kind of between the epidural space and my bony tissue. I have some connective tissue that helps to hold together those vertebrae of the spine. So you are correct, and that is an error that I'm working on correcting for us here. So when you're studying your dura mater, that's going to be number 9. Dura mater. That's this guy. Let's see if I can zoom in any closer. Kind of, yep. Start to kind of color it in. Number 9. This part right here. That's the dura mater. This here on the outside is connective tissue. So just connective tissue between the vertebrae. Then we've got our epidural space. Then we have the dura mater that's right next to it. The arachnoid mater is this little thing that we see here. The subarachnoid space is the gray area that I can see here. So yes, that is correct, that is an error. Yeah, working on getting that fixed for you. All right, let's see. Got about 5 minutes left. Are there any particular structures on the big spinal cord model that we wanted to see? Because we've labeled most of those ones on the little spinal cord model. Are there any big ones? Okay, musculocutaneous nerve. Yeah, so we want to look at maybe some of those nerves. I remember somebody had asked about those spinal nerves too. So let me go here and pull up Nerve Man. Here's Nerve Man. We went through and labeled all of these nerves on Tuesday, so I'm not going to go through and label all of them, but we did have a particular question about the musculocutaneous nerve, so I'll mention that one for us here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. When we talk about the nerves in the body, those nerves all come off of plexuses. So plexuses are the things that we see. See how right here, for example, a whole bunch of nerves are weaving together and they look kind of funky. See how up here I've got nerves that are kind of weaving together and they look funky. If I go down a little bit, I got some more weird looking nerves right here, and then obviously the big one down here. Those are my plexuses. So the nerves that we're asking you guys to identify are things that when I share neurons between the spinal nerves that come off of the spinal cord, I make these big nerves that we see in the body. That's the names that you see over here. All of these names that I see come from after I formed a plexus. So the one in particular that we're looking for is musculocutaneous. The tip off for us in this one right here is the cutaneous part. Cutaneous. What does cutaneous refer to? Do we know? Cutaneous. Yeah, exactly. Cutaneous means skin. So when we're looking for the musculocutaneous nerve, this is one of the nerves that we actually find. Here's where we get to use our anatomy words again. It's one of them that I find in the arm region, not the forearm, in the arm, so in the upper part of the arm. If we're looking here at our model, see how there's this nerve, and I know it's a little bit light to see, but there's this nerve right up here. Zoom in a little bit. That's as close as I can get. Got the nerve right here. The musculocutaneous nerve, this one out here that's going to muscles, but also very close to the skin in this region. This one here is the musculocutaneous nerve. I also have this one up here in the shoulder. We talked about this in office hours. What's the name of this one that's up here in the shoulder that I can see right here? Do we remember? Yes, that's where the axillary nerve lives. Yeah, so the axillary nerve lives up really high around the shoulder. It does start, based on its regional terms, axillary is the armpit region. This nerve actually does start in the armpit region. See its little line right there, but it wraps around the outside of the humerus. So the axillary nerve, we mostly see it here in the shoulder region, here on the outside. So the axillary nerve in the shoulder region, the musculocutaneous nerve, we can see it on both sides down a little bit lower, going out to the skin that I find out here on the arm, and some of those muscles that are out here on the arm as well. Pam, I saw your hand. I don't know if it's a new question or if it was up from the old one. If you have another question, feel free to speak it out. Otherwise, I think it might have just been the notification from before. Yes, the musculocutaneous nerve is going to be more superficial. That's correct. Yeah, so the axillary nerve is a little bit more deep, controlling the deltoid muscle up here in the shoulder. It's more deep, hugging that humerus. Musculocutaneous is more here going toward the skin, more toward the outside. Okay, well, we are about out of time for the day. We hit everything that you guys told me you wanted to talk about today. What I want you guys to think about as we start getting ready for next week and for office hours next week, on Monday, I'm going to do one more big lab review session. So as you're studying this weekend, as you're working on the homework assignment for this week's stuff, as you're working with that practice assignment, that you find posted for you. That's just an optional review assignment. Please think about the topics that you have for next week that we want to talk about. Monday at 9:30, I will do one more big hurrah lab review session. So plan to bring those questions. I know I saw a question about the reflex arc, so bring that with on Monday. We can talk about the reflex arc. Any other questions that you come up with during your studying, please feel free to bring those with you to Monday's class. Friendly reminder here, I'll pull up my whiteboard one more time for my friends that came in just a little bit later. Remember that we have the optional lab final review assignment. It is not worth any credit, but it's kind of like a lab final, a mock lab final, put it that way, mock lab final. Since there's no grade, answer only the questions that will help you or only the questions that you want to. And you can go through and do it as many times as you have time for, because this will really help you assess yourself or check yourself to see what you do and don't know. So it's completely optional. It's not going to have any effect on your grades, so you never have to sit down and go through and complete the entire thing like we do with the homework. So keep that in mind. Any last minute questions before I stop our recording and call it a day for us? About that assignment, about what's due Sunday night, excuse me. So Pilar asked, the review does not cover everything. Is that correct? So every time you pull it up, it will not cover all of the topics because it's pulling 44 questions out of, honestly, our pool has about 800. So it's pulling 44 out of 800, which means that it's not going to cover everything. That's correct. So do it as many times as you want to and as you can, because then you'll see more of those questions and hopefully hit more of those topics. Absolutely. And again, since it's not actually for a grade, you can go through and you can do it a ton of different times and see a bunch of different questions. And it doesn't matter how many of them you answer because it's never actually for a score. The exam is going to have 50 questions. This review assignment has 44. Remember, we talked about how it has the review assignment, it's literally pulling homework questions. So there's our questions that have, 4 or 6 parts to them. On the lab exam, there's not going to be more than 2 parts in a question. So if we were identifying stuff on the spinal cord model, for example, I would maybe ask you to identify the dorsal root ganglion and the white matter funiculi, and that's it. On the homework assignment, I might ask you for the dorsal root ganglion and the funiculi and the lateral horn and 5 or 6 parts. So it's much more exhaustive than what you'll see on the exam. So Pilar asked, we can assume the exam comes from the homework questions. Not exactly, but kind of. We completely different pool that we're using for the final exam questions. So the things that we asked you about on the homework are the exact same things that we'll ask you about on the final exam. So kind of, but it's not exactly the same questions that you see on the homework assignments. We're creating a different pool of questions for that, but the same topics, yes. Exactly, Pam. That's basically what I did a bad job communicating, is if you know your stuff on the homework assignments, if you're knocking it out of the park on the lab final review assignment, you are 100% set for the exam. Absolutely. Yeah. So if you know the homework, you'll do just fine on the lab exam. That's correct. All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording for the day and stick around for a little bit. So for all my friends joining us on the recording, have a great weekend. And I'm going to let you guys go.